1999 or so, the ideas that the sharing of information were going to change the way we did business and the way the economy worked were new ideas. Those were in the book Blur. I hope that this book proves to be as useful in the next 10 years as that has been to people in the last. I came to Turkey the first time in 1999 for the total eclipse of the sun. So to come here to talk about a book called Standing on the Sun is somehow poetically appropriate. After that eclipse, there was an earthquake. And maybe that's appropriate too, because according to the people at Davos last month, there is an earthquake going on in our economic system globally. Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, said last month, capitalism in its current form no longer fits the world around us. That's a very strong statement coming from the World Economic Forum. And Ian Bremmer, a noted economist, said, the folks at Davos are calling it the Great Transformation. They are searching for new models. So where might we find new models? The first question is there actually a crisis in capitalism going on? And I would argue that it is not so much a crisis as an important shift. Shift is the first word of the title of your session. And what I want to do is to take you back in terms of perspective to see what's happening. The book is called Standing on the Sun because a physicist said to me once, talking about Copernicus, that in order to understand the way the solar system works, Copernicus had to be standing on the sun. He had to take a perspective from outside the system. So I want to give you a perspective on capitalism and how it changes. Why are you looking at these birds? Well, because these are finches from the Galapagos Island. And Darwin, when he went to the Galapagos, noted that they had different shaped beaks. And why was that? Because their food was in different shaped flowers. And he found, and scientists have studied since, that the beak of the finch evolves very rapidly to reflect its environment. And I'm talking about that because capitalists are the same. The movement of capitalism doesn't happen through the decisions of people at Davos. It happens through individual entrepreneurs and capitalists and investors making decisions one at a time. So if capitalism is adapting to its environment and it's shifting, it must be because its environment has changed. So let's look at that. For the past century or so, the environment of capitalism has been the G7 countries, the rich world. In 1840, China was still the world's largest economy, but since then, it's been essentially the G7 economies that have been the source of growth. Now it's the emerging economies. The orange-colored nations are the BRIC countries plus the so-called Next 11. So 15 emerging economies, of which you can see Turkey is one. And if you were a finch, that is, if you were a capitalist, how would you see this environment as different? Well, I think you all know that the emerging economies are the source of growth in the world economy, but let me just show you how strong those numbers are. That if you look at the G7 countries, in the 5 years from 2004 to 2009, their aggregate growth over 5 years was only 1%, $30 billion or so. Whereas the emerging nations grew at 22%. And even though the gross domestic product of those nations is only 1/7 or so, the growth at 120 billion is about 4 times as large as the rich economy growth. So if you're following the money, you are interested in the emerging economies. Second point, look at the GDP per capita. People who earn $3,000 a year want different things from the people who earn $27,000. So this has an implication for people doing business and trying to capture that growth. And just as important as GDP, perhaps more so in the long run, is the age distribution. The median age, 42 versus 28. More important, the proportion under 15, more than twice, almost twice as high in the emerging economies. But an important thing is what is not different here, and that is connectivity. Alper discussed the role of technology, connectivity, and information in forming this next economy. And you see that with respect to cell phones per capita, just a proxy for connectivity, the people in the emerging nations are almost as connected as people in the G7 countries. So what? So number one, by 2050, the roles will have reversed. The G7 countries are 3/4 of the world GDP today. They'll be down to 32% in 2050. You can already see that the world's largest companies are starting to move out of the rich countries. So the share outside of mature economies has almost tripled in the past decade. And if we think about who is going to understand how to make the technology that's now available productive, it is the so-called digital natives, the people who were born with the internet. That 28% of the emerging economy population that's under 15 today, that is born since the internet was readily available. So if you're a capitalist, the environment of growth has moved from the high-income, slow-growth, aging populations of the G7 to the low-income, high-growth, youthful populations of the emerging economies. And we've seen this story once before. Because if you were thinking about industrialization in, say, 1860, most of the technology, chemistry, electricity, metallurgy, most of the technology was developed in the British Isles. But in England and Scotland, there was a big embedded base of an agricultural economy. There were farms, there were hostlers, there were all the things that went with the agricultural environment. The place that industrial technology created a new society was the emerging economy of its day, the United States. Young, rapidly growing, relatively poor. So today, 100 years later, where are we? The United States developed a lot of the information technology that's changing the world today, but it is India, China, and the rest of the emerging economies that will figure out what the rules are for making this technology productive. The rich world is going to have to catch up. So let's talk about the process of this change. Back to the birds. Why am I showing you a peacock? Did you ever think biologically about how the peacock got this tail? Why does it have this enormous plumage? And the answer is simple. It's the peahens. The females prefer to mate with peacocks with big tails. It's sort of the Ferrari of the bird world. And the issue is this. Originally, that was a good idea. A big tail was a sign of health. But that meant that the tail got bigger and bigger generation to generation. And what you have now is a species that is not thriving as well as it should because of the sexual selection criterion. The tail gets big, it's expensive, you have to eat a lot to grow it, you have to carry this heavy thing around, and if the honey badger is introduced into your environment, you're too slow to get away from it. So it turns out that while peacocks may be beautiful, there are fewer of them than there would be if the females were more eclectic in their tastes. So what does this have to do with capitalism? In the beginning, back in 1860, as we scaled up the Industrial Revolution, what was the scarce resource? It was equity capital. So we developed a whole economy based on the idea of maximizing ROE. And ROE has now become like the peacock's tail. Investment capital isn't scarce. If it were scarce, there couldn't be speculators making so much of it slosh around the world. It's just a matter of who gets to use it. And for the moment, we've given an awful lot of it to the financial traders rather than to people who can make productive use of it. So we have a kind of peacock's tail, what's called a runaway effect, which leads in biology to biological suicide. And it's leading us here into a kind of economic extinction of the economies that are purely driven by ROE. And so I want to give you, in the book, there are 5 rules that are going to change as a result of this evolution of capitalism. I only have time in this talk to talk about one of them, although I'm talking again this evening and we'll go into all of them. But this financial orientation and the financial evaluation of how we do as individuals, as companies, GDP, as economies, we liken to seeing the world in black and white. It's only one dimension of the way the world works. Now, in 1973, the King of Bhutan suggested that it might not be the most important way for his country. So the King of Bhutan said, we are not going to maximize GDP, we're going to maximize gross national happiness. Now, most people reacted that this was kind of a fun idea and that the King of Bhutan had said something provocative, but they didn't take it terribly seriously. In 2008, Nicolas Sarkozy in France commissioned 2 Nobel Prize-winning economists to study what it is that France should be maximizing. Joe Stiglitz and Amartya Sen. And by 2011, there was an effort underway in Britain to measure happiness, and in 41 other countries. And in 2011, China announced that it would measure happiness. So this idea that seemed vaguely silly to economists when Bhutan talked about it has become the leading edge of policy thinking. And even a nation of 780 million people, namely Facebook, has developed the idea that social media are an interesting way to gather information on happiness. And their researcher who leads this work asks a very simple question. If we know that money doesn't buy happiness, why are we optimizing for money? Well, one reason is we know how to measure it. So if we're going to optimize for a broader set of measures for something other than tail size, how are we going to do it? So Bhutan created an institute to study this question. Some of the best work that I know comes from the Legatum Institute, which has developed a prosperity index that you see here. And it has 8 dimensions. Economy is one of them. You can read the rest around this octagon. So you can go to the website and pick any countries you like. There are about 200 for which there are data, and compare them. So here you see Turkey, Bulgaria, I picked as a neighbor, and China. And one of the things you see is that in certain respects, these 3 are very close, say ranking on health. Regarding safety and security, they're quite different. Personal freedom, somewhat different. I don't want to defend a particular analysis of Legatum, which is just getting started in this work. But the point is, once you see this picture, you can start to think about, as a policymaker, what is it you're trying to achieve? And for that matter, as a company, what is it that the people who work for you and partner with you want out of their lives, and how can you create some kinds of incentives and participations that are non-financial? And I'll just add the number 1 ranked country, that's Norway, the red circle there, or the red spider chart. And one of the things that I think is interesting is there seems to be less dispersion on the economic variables than on the social variables. And to me, that suggests the peahens at work. That because historically we've been all focused on maximizing economic value, then that's where all the resources have gone. But the countries whose people report themselves as happiest are not so focused on economy as they are on these social variables. And now that we can begin to measure it, perhaps we can bring policies in line. As a company, what does it tell you? It tells you rather than solely maximizing shareholder value, which in the United States has been the mania for the past 25 years, you want to measure and maximize value across all stakeholders. All stakeholders. Because you are a member of the society in which you operate. Now, I have time for just a little bit, a couple of examples of companies doing this. Here's an interesting way in which you could imagine a rule of capitalism that we take for granted might change. The way we might select for one shape of a beak and against another, in other words. So this is a story from 3 months ago. So the Chinese and Indian drug makers are on the verge of selling cheaper copies of huge sellers such as Herceptin. Point is, they're learning to make biotech drugs, not just small molecule drugs. Their entry could not only transform the care of patients, but also ignite a counterattack by major pharmaceutical companies and diplomats from richer countries. So can we just think about that for a second? You have a drug that can save lives. You have somebody who can make it available to more people. And the prediction here is that the people making it would be attacked by people who have been selling it at a higher price, and that their diplomats would help them. This seems like not the way we want our global economy to work. How do you think that story is going to come out? Well, let's put it to the digital natives, the people who are used to not only checking in on Foursquare, but to sharing information, sharing music and other kinds of files, and who understand that a drug is just a piece of code, is another way of expressing information in chemical form. To them, it will seem ridiculous that the patent value, the margins of producers should be protected when there are lives at stake. And so we will find new models that will incent people. Perhaps saving lives will be enough to incent people, but will also financially incent people without artificially inflating the margins of drug companies through essentially monopoly power. So that's how I believe this will come out. And if we say, well, this will never happen, I would quote to you Angela Merkel speaking to the European Union, saying a community says that regardless of what happens in the rest of the world, it can never again change its ground rules. That community simply can't survive. So the companies, the diplomats in the rich world who might sue China and India for making useful drugs are not going to win that battle. And the last story I want to tell you is about GE, because a handful of global companies have gotten this message already. And GE is running its health business in a truly globalized way. They understand that the market for electrocardiographs in the future is in India, not in the rich countries. And they also understand that an Indian health clinic can't afford a $5,000 machine. So they sent some of the engineers who had been working for a group in Connecticut in the United States, but they had been working in Bangalore, out to find out what kind of a cardiograph they needed in India. So the engineers charged with creating more products at more price points for their own country go out with the doctors, and they discover that what is needed is a cardiograph that can ride on the back of a motor scooter, survive the bumps and the dust, and work at a clinic where there's no electrical power. And it had to cost $500. Now, for the average company, this poses a dilemma. Do we make a $500 machine that's going to cannibalize our $5,000 sales? Or do we serve the Indian market where it stands? And GE has understood that if they don't make that innovation, somebody else will, and that that's where their future lies. But they've also understood something that it gives to their employees. So I want you to listen to one of the engineers who worked on this product. So this engineer in India is motivated to do his best work, not by his compensation, but by his impact on his own company, on his own country, and his mission of providing affordable access to health care. So what I want to leave you with is why the emerging economies are so important to the finding of new models, as Klaus Schwab said we need to do. The emerging economies get to make the choices, and it's not that they are a new source of labor and materials or inexpensive labor. It's not that they're rapidly growing markets, although that's important. And it's not even for their technical innovation skills and the opportunity for reverse innovation. The importance of the emerging economies is that they are where the new rules of capitalism are being born, and it's up to you to select what that next form of capitalism will be. Thanks very much.